50,000 people were screaming. Elvis was at the peak of his power. Then he saw one little girl and forgot every word. What he did next turned a concert into something nobody will ever forget. It's a sold-out stadium. The energy is absolutely electric. Thousands of people packed shoulder to shoulder, all of them there for one reason, to see the king of rock and roll perform live. The lights are flashing. The band is playing full force. Elvis is in complete control, commanding the stage like only he could. But then something happens that nobody expected. In the middle of performing one of his biggest hits, Elvis suddenly stops. The music keeps playing. The crowd keeps cheering, but Elvis isn't singing anymore. He's staring into the audience, at something or someone that's caught his attention. And what happens next will change everything. If you love stories about humanity, kindness, and moments that prove one person can still make a difference in this world, you're going to want to stick around for this one. Let me set the scene for you properly. It's a night like any other Elvis concert. The stadium is absolutely packed. I'm talking every single seat filled, people standing in the aisles. The air is thick with anticipation. Everyone's been waiting for this moment to see the king perform live. The stage setup is incredible. Professional lighting rigs pointing in every direction. A full band ready to play. The kind of production value that only major celebrities could pull off back then. And standing in the center of it all is Elvis Presley at the absolute peak of his career. The show starts, and it's everything people hoped for. Elvis is singing. The crowd is singing along. There's this electricity that you can only feel at a live performance, especially one of this magnitude. Thousands of voices together, all connected by the music and the moment. Elvis has spent years perfecting this craft. He knows exactly how to work a crowd. One gesture, and thousands of people react. He moves left, and the audience leans left. He points, and 50,000 people feel like he's pointing directly at them. This is what superstardom looks like. But here's the thing about being on stage in front of that many people. After a while, the crowd becomes this blur. It's no longer individual faces. It's this sea of humanity. You stop seeing people. You start seeing this collective energy. That night, though, something shifted. Elvis was performing, doing what he'd done hundreds of times before, when his eyes wandered past the front rows. He was scanning the crowd, like he always did, looking for that connection. But then he noticed something unusual. There was a man in the audience, a father. He was standing among thousands of other people, but something about his stance caught Elvis's attention. His arms were tense, his shoulders were straining slightly, and he had a little girl sitting on his shoulders. Now parents bring kids to concerts all the time. That's not unusual, but this was different. The girl, she had to be maybe 5 or 6 years old. She was small, and the crowd around her was massive. If her father had put her down, she wouldn't be able to see anything. All those adults standing in front of her, all those people taller than her, she'd just see backs and shoulders. So the father had done what any parent would do. He'd lifted her up high enough to see over the crowd, and he was keeping her there even though it was clearly exhausting him. His muscles were visibly straining, but he wasn't giving up because his daughter deserved to see the show. And the girl, she was absolutely captivated. Her eyes were locked on Elvis, not moving, not distracted, just completely, totally focused on him. She was watching every movement he made, every step, every gesture. The wonder in her little face was unmistakable. This was the most magical thing she'd ever seen. Elvis noticed her staring, and something about that pure, innocent wonder got to him. He looked away, continued singing, then looked back. She was still there, still watching, still completely amazed by what she was seeing. And Elvis smiled. The girl smiled back. In that moment, something shifted in the room. Elvis wasn't just performing anymore. He was present. He was actually seeing this little girl instead of looking through her the way you do with crowds. Here's what happened next. Elvis continued singing, but now he kept glancing back at the girl and her father. The music was still playing perfectly. The band was locked in. Everything was running smoothly. But Elvis's mind had gone somewhere else. He was watching the father adjust his position, trying to find a more comfortable way to hold his daughter while still letting her see. He was watching the girl lean forward, trying to see better. He was watching this relationship between a parent who would literally hold up his child forever if that's what it took, and a daughter who was just trying to see the magic. And Elvis realized something in that moment. This girl had come to this concert to see him. Her father had brought her. Her father was carrying her. Her father was suffering through the physical pain just so his daughter could have this experience. That's love, that's sacrifice, and Elvis understood the weight of that immediately. As he continued performing, Elvis made a decision that most superstars never make. He decided that this little girl mattered more than maintaining the perfect performance. He looked toward the band. The musicians knew Elvis. They could read him. They could tell when he was about to do something unexpected. And when they saw that look, they started to get ready for whatever was about to happen. Elvis slowed his singing. The band responded. One instrument after another began to fade. The music got quieter and quieter until finally there was silence. 50,000 people went completely silent. People stopped moving. They didn't know what was happening. Was something wrong? Did Elvis feel sick? Did he forget the words? The crowd was confused, but they waited. Because when you're watching someone like Elvis Presley, you don't interrupt. You wait to see what happens next. Elvis stood beneath the lights in complete silence. The stadium was holding its breath, and then he slowly raised his hand and pointed. He pointed directly at the father holding his daughter. "You," Elvis said into the microphone, his voice clear and strong. "Sir." The father froze. 50,000 people turned to look at him. He was suddenly the center of attention in a stadium of thousands. He was holding his daughter tighter, probably not sure what was happening. Elvis smiled. "What's your name?" The father's voice cracked when he tried to answer. He had to swallow and try again before he could speak, but he told Elvis his name. Elvis repeated it back slowly, respectfully. Then he looked at the girl and waved. The little girl lifted her tiny hand and waved back. The stadium erupted. The applause was thunderous. The father laughed. The girl laughed. For a moment, the whole place was filled with this genuine joy and excitement. But then Elvis's expression changed slightly. He looked at the father again, and you could see something shift in Elvis's face. He was realizing something deeper about this moment. "She's been up there the whole time," Elvis said, pointing at the girl. "The entire concert." The father nodded. "So she could see me?" Elvis asked. Another nod. Elvis didn't say anything for a moment. He just looked at this man who had literally been holding his daughter on his shoulders through an entire concert, muscles burning, just so she could have this memory. And then Elvis looked down at the stage like he was thinking about something. The crowd waited. The energy in the stadium shifted. Everyone could feel that something important was about to happen. Then Elvis raised the microphone again, and his voice was different this time. Softer, more serious, more intentional. "I think I should probably go see her," Elvis said. The crowd didn't cheer yet. They waited. Elvis turned toward security. "Bring them up here." The father looked at his daughter. The girl smiled at him, not really understanding what was happening, just knowing that Elvis was still looking at her. Security began making a path through the crowd. People moved aside. This was happening. The father, holding his daughter, began walking toward the stage. The walk felt long. It probably took less than a minute, but to that father, it probably felt like forever. All those eyes on him, all those people watching, but he kept moving forward because his daughter deserved to get closer to the stage. When they reached the barricade, security helped them through. The father climbed onto the stage, his daughter still in his arms. Elvis waited. He didn't rush them. He didn't look impatient or annoyed. He just stood there, waiting for them to reach him. And then the father and daughter were standing on the stage, just a few feet away from Elvis Presley. The stadium became silent again. Elvis looked down at the little girl. The girl looked up at Elvis. And then Elvis did something that made the entire crowd gasp. He got down on one knee. The king of rock and roll knelt in front of a little girl, not because anyone told him to, not because the cameras were rolling, not because he was performing. He did it because he wanted to look her in the eye to eye, human to human. The father covered his mouth, tears streaming down his face. Elvis extended his hand toward the girl. She hesitated for just a second, then slowly reached out her little hand and took his. Their hands touched. The girl smiled. Elvis smiled back. And in that moment, the stadium didn't feel like a stadium anymore. The crowd noise faded away. The cameras disappeared. The lights dimmed in everyone's mind. There was just a father, his daughter, and a man who had decided that this little girl deserved to be seen. Elvis slowly stood up. He picked up the microphone again. He looked out at the crowd, all 50,000 people watching. And he said something that would stay with everyone in that stadium forever. Sometimes, Elvis said, his voice echoing through the building, we get so busy watching the stage that we forget to look at the people standing in front of it. The stadium was completely quiet. People were hearing exactly what they needed to hear. Elvis squeezed the girl's hand gently, but tonight, he continued, I saw her. The father lowered his head. Tears rolled down his face. Elvis looked toward the father. You've been carrying her all night. The father nodded, unable to speak. You carried her so she could see me, Elvis said. He looked back at the girl, then toward the crowd, and his voice became even softer, more emotional. But you know something. The stadium waited. You carried her so she could see me, Elvis said. Then he raised the girl's hand. But tonight, I want everybody to see her. The stadium erupted. 50,000 people stood up. The applause was deafening, but it wasn't the polite applause you give a performance. This was different. This was people genuinely moved by what they were witnessing. The little girl looked around in confusion. She didn't really understand why everyone was cheering. She just knew that Elvis was holding her hand and all these people were standing up. She smiled. Elvis smiled back. He leaned toward the microphone again. Tonight, he looked at the girl, you're not just watching the show. Tonight, he raised her hand higher, you're part of it. The father broke down crying. The crowd roared. But Elvis wasn't done yet. He turned toward the band, thought for a moment, and then he made a decision that surprised everyone. He slowly extended the microphone toward the girl. For a second, nobody moved. The band froze, the father froze, even the crowd seemed to hold its breath. Elvis was going to let her sing. The little girl stared at the microphone. It's okay, Elvis said softly, his voice gentle and reassuring. You can try, take your time. He wasn't rushing her, he wasn't putting pressure on her, he was just giving her permission. The girl slowly took the microphone. She looked at it, then at Elvis, then back at the crowd. Thousands of faces staring at her. The smallest person in the entire stadium about to try to sing in front of the largest crowd she'd ever seen. The girl didn't sing at first. She just held the microphone and smiled nervously. Elvis looked toward the band. Hold on, he said. The musicians stopped. The stadium went quiet. Elvis turned toward the crowd. You know, he said, we've been singing for you all night, but I think we should let her have a turn. The crowd erupted. Elvis nodded at the girl. Go ahead. The girl brought the microphone to her mouth. The entire stadium waited. Thousands of people, millions watching on television if this was being broadcast, all waiting to hear a little girl try to sing. And then she made a sound. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't polished. It wasn't the kind of thing a professional would produce, but it was pure, it was honest, it was a little girl singing. The stadium exploded with applause. Elvis immediately started clapping, not politely, not because he had to, He clapped with genuine excitement and pride. The band joined in. The audience rose to their feet. The girl's face lit up. She looked around at all the people clapping for her, and something clicked inside her. They weren't laughing at her. They weren't staring because she was doing something wrong. They were cheering for her. She looked at Elvis. Elvis pointed toward the audience. "See that? They're all listening to you." The girl smiled, and in that moment she understood. She belonged here, on this stage, in this moment, with 50,000 people cheering for her. The father couldn't stop crying. He had spent so much of his life protecting his daughter, protecting her from the stares, protecting her from the people who whispered, protecting her from people who didn't understand or didn't accept her. And now, in front of 50,000 people, his daughter was being celebrated. Not pitied, not tolerated. Celebrated. Elvis slowly took the microphone back. He looked at the father, and his expression became serious again. "You know what I like about her?" Elvis asked. The father looked confused. Elvis pointed at the girl. "She doesn't care what anybody thinks." The crowd laughed softly. "She just wanted to see the show," Elvis continued. "But now everybody wants to see her." The audience erupted again. The girl laughed. Elvis laughed with her. Then Elvis crouched down beside the girl. "Do you like music?" The girl nodded enthusiastically. "Good," Elvis said. He looked toward the band. "Let's give her some music." The musicians began playing. A familiar rhythm filled the stadium, a song that the crowd knew. Elvis started singing, but this time it was different. The little girl stood beside him on the stage. Every few seconds, Elvis glanced down at her. The girl watched him carefully, then tried to move with the rhythm, trying to dance like he was dancing. Elvis noticed. He smiled and exaggerated his movements so she could follow along. The crowd noticed, too. Thousands of people watching this tiny girl try to dance with Elvis. Soon, thousands of people were clapping along with the beat. The father stood there, his hand over his mouth, tears streaming down his face. His daughter was standing on a stage in front of 50,000 people. And she wasn't afraid. She was smiling. The song continued. Elvis moved toward the girl, then stepped back. The girl tried to follow his movements. Elvis laughed. The audience laughed. The girl laughed. It was beautiful. For a few moments, the entire stadium felt like one big family. When the song ended, the applause was thunderous. Elvis looked at the girl, then at her father and said, "Come here." The girl moved closer. Elvis placed an arm around her, then looked out across the entire stadium. "I want you to remember this," Elvis said. His voice wasn't the showman's voice anymore. It was genuine, it was real. The stadium quieted immediately. "Not because she's standing beside Elvis Presley," Elvis continued. He paused. He looked down at the girl. "But because she belongs here." The father closed his eyes. Those words hit him harder than anything else that had happened all night, because that was what every parent wants for their child. Not fame, not applause, not a perfect life. Just a place in the world where their child can stand without feeling ashamed, where they can be themselves, where they can exist without fear of judgment. Elvis had given that to her, at least for one night. The girl reached for Elvis's hand. Elvis took it. The girl looked toward her father, then back toward Elvis. And the father realized something important in that moment. His daughter wasn't looking at him for permission anymore. She wasn't asking, "Is it okay? Am I allowed to do this?" She was just enjoying the moment. She was present. She was confident. The father smiled through his tears. Elvis raised the girl's hand. The audience erupted, but Elvis wasn't finished. He turned toward the father. "You've been carrying her all night." The father nodded. "I think you deserve a break," Elvis said, and the crowd laughed with him. Elvis looked down at the girl. "Because now," Elvis said, "I can carry her." The stadium exploded. For a moment, the father wasn't sure if he'd heard that correctly. Did Elvis Presley just offer to carry his daughter? Elvis gently reached toward the girl. The father carefully helped her forward. Elvis Presley lifted the little girl into his arms. The girl wrapped her arms around his neck, and Elvis held her securely. The stadium erupted. The girl was laughing. Elvis was laughing. The father was openly crying now, not trying to hide it, just letting the tears flow. Thousands of people were standing. Thousands of people were clapping and cheering. And for one extraordinary moment, the king of rock and roll was holding the child who had spent the entire concert trying to see him. Elvis looked at the girl and quietly asked, "You came a long way to see me, didn't you?" The girl smiled and nodded. Elvis smiled back. "Well," he said, looking toward the audience, "I'm glad you made it." The applause became thunderous. Then Elvis looked at the father. His expression became completely serious. "You know something," Elvis said. The father listened intently. "Don't ever think she can't do something just because the world says it's difficult," Elvis continued. "Sometimes all somebody needs is one person willing to believe in them." The father stared at him, processing those words. Elvis gently handed the girl back to her father. Then he stepped toward the microphone. The crowd slowly quieted. Elvis looked across the stadium. "All of you came here tonight to see me," he said. The crowd cheered. "But I want you to remember something." He pointed toward the father and daughter. "Tonight, this little girl taught me something." The audience became completely silent. Elvis looked at the girl, then said, "The biggest person in the room isn't always the one standing on the stage." The crowd erupted. The applause was different this time. It wasn't excitement, it was recognition. It was people understanding a profound truth being spoken to them. The father looked at his daughter. The girl smiled. Elvis smiled too. But then the music began again. This time, the girl didn't stand behind Elvis. She stood beside him, under the brightest spotlight in the stadium, in front of 50,000 people. The smallest person on the stage, who somehow had become the most important person in the stadium. When the final chorus began, the girl lifted her hand. Elvis lifted his hand right next to hers. The crowd followed. Thousands of hands rose into the air. The stadium became a sea of people united by what they were witnessing. As the final notes began to fade, Elvis looked toward the girl, then toward her father. His expression became serious again. Because there was something Elvis hadn't said yet, something the father needed to hear, something that would turn a beautiful concert moment into a memory that would stay with that family forever. Elvis slowly walked toward the father. He put a hand on his shoulder. "There's something I want you to promise me," Elvis said quietly. The father froze. 50,000 people waited. "Promise me," Elvis said, looking directly into the father's eyes, "that you'll never let her believe she doesn't belong." The father couldn't speak. Those words hit him harder than anything that had happened that night. Elvis continued, "People are going to tell her what she can't do. They're going to look at her differently." The father lowered his eyes because he knew this was true. He had already experienced it. Stares, questions, limitations placed on his daughter by people who didn't know her. "But you," Elvis gently lifted the man's chin so their eyes met again, "you keep telling her she can." The father finally managed to speak. "I promise." Elvis nodded. "When she forgets," Elvis smiled, "you remind her." The father nodded, unable to say anything else. Elvis looked out toward the crowd. For several seconds, he said nothing. 50,000 people stood completely still. Then Elvis raised the microphone. "All night long," his voice echoed through the stadium, "you came here to see Elvis Presley." The crowd erupted. "But tonight," Elvis turned toward the girl, "I think Elvis Presley came here to see somebody else." The stadium fell silent again. Elvis reached for the girl's hand. He raised it up. "This little girl," Elvis said. The crowd erupted. The girl looked around, still confused about why everyone was cheering, but happy nonetheless. Elvis looked down at her. You know something? The girl looked up at him. You made me stop, Elvis said. He smiled. You know how many people were screaming my name tonight? The girl didn't answer. Elvis looked toward the crowd, 50,000 people. The audience laughed and cheered. But I heard you, Elvis continued, not because you shouted louder. He looked back at the girl. Not because you pushed your way to the front, you didn't need to. A pause. You just looked at me, Elvis said. He squeezed the girl's hand, and that was enough. The father began crying again. Elvis turned toward the band. Let's do one more song. The musicians prepared. But not for me, Elvis looked at the girl. For her. The music began slowly at first, then the stadium filled with sound. Elvis began singing. The girl stood beside him. The father stood behind them. And 50,000 people sang along. But the atmosphere had completely changed. Nobody was watching Elvis the way they had before. They were watching the girl. The little girl who had entered the stadium as just another face in the crowd was now standing beneath the brightest lights. Elvis sang, then turned toward the girl. The girl smiled. Elvis smiled back. The father watched his son and realized something profound. People weren't staring at his daughter because she was different. They were watching her because she mattered. The song reached its final chorus. Elvis stepped closer to the girl. He put an arm around her, then looked out across the stadium. Come on, he said. He raised the girl's hand. Let's hear it for her. The audience exploded. The sound was enormous. The girl's face lit up with pure joy. She looked at her father. Her father nodded and smiled. The girl turned back toward Elvis, and Elvis whispered something only she could hear. The girl smiled even bigger. The final note rang through the stadium. Then silence. 1 second, 2. And suddenly, the entire stadium rose to their feet. 50,000 people standing, applauding, shouting, crying. The girl stood beside Elvis. The father stood behind her. Elvis looked at them both. For a moment, nobody moved. Then Elvis slowly knelt again in front of the girl. He looked directly into her eyes. Did you have a good night? Elvis asked. The girl nodded enthusiastically. Good, Elvis said. He held out his hand. The girl took it. Elvis looked at the father. You did good. The father shook his head. No, he said. He looked at his daughter. She did. Elvis shook his head. No, you did. The father stepped forward. He shook Elvis's hand. His voice broke when he spoke. Thank you. Elvis immediately shook his head. Don't thank me. The father looked confused. I didn't do anything, Elvis said. He smiled at the girl. I just saw her. The father couldn't hold it together anymore. He pulled his daughter into his arms. The girl hugged him. Elvis stood quietly beside them, not trying to make it bigger, not posing for the cameras, just being present in the moment. Perhaps he understood something fundamental that night. A superstar can make thousands of people scream. But sometimes, the most important thing you can do is make one person feel seen. Eventually, the father and daughter prepared to leave the stage. The girl took a few steps, then stopped. She turned around. She looked at Elvis and waved. Elvis waved back. The girl waved again. Elvis smiled. Then the father gently guided his daughter toward the edge of the stage. They disappeared into the crowd. And Elvis Presley continued watching the place where they had disappeared long after they were gone. Because that night, he hadn't just performed a concert. He had given one little girl something much bigger than a moment with a celebrity. He had given her a memory of standing beneath the lights, a memory of 50,000 people applauding for her. a memory of her father carrying her through a crowd, and a memory of Elvis Presley looking directly into her eyes and saying, without needing to say the words, "You belong here." Years might pass, the crowd might forget the songs, the lights might disappear, but some moments don't disappear. They stay because they're remembered not for how famous the person was, but for how someone made another human being feel. If this story moved you, if it reminds you why we should always take time to see the people around us, please hit that like button and subscribe for more stories that matter. Because the world needs more people willing to pause and see.